The morning haze still clung to the windows of the small diner on 43rd and Mayfair. It wasn't a fancy place, just chrome stools, linoleum floors, and a coffee machine that hissed like an old train engine. But to Mason, it was sacred ground. Every day. Before the city fully woke, he clocked in just past 5 a.m., apron already tied, shoes already wet from the dew-soaked walk. He was 24, lean with dark eyes that carried the tiredness of someone who knew what sacrifice tasted like. The regulars came in waves, bus drivers, nurses from the overnight shift, an elderly couple who always ordered half a grapefruit and split it silently. But there was one man Mason noticed right away, not because he was loud or important. In fact, it was the opposite. He came in quietly, always alone, always around 6:15. A tan coat, scuffed shoes, wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't order anything fancy, just black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He took a booth by the window, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled in it with a stub of a pencil. His presence wasn't large, but it lingered. On Mason's third morning, he brought over the coffee without being asked. The man looked up with a slight nod, the kind you give someone you see often enough to feel familiar, but not quite close enough to speak. "It's on me," Mason said, and it was all he said. "Does he?" Men studied him for a second, then offered a faint smile. He didn't protest, and that was how it began. Every morning after, Mason made sure the man had his coffee, never took a cent. It wasn't about money, at least not in the way people usually meant it. Mason knew the cost of things. He worked 2 jobs. He lived with his younger brother in a 1-bedroom apartment. Their mother, once a nurse, had passed 3 years earlier. Their father never in the picture. Life hadn't handed Mason much, but it had taught him that sometimes giving quietly was the only way to stay human. He didn't know the man's name, didn't ask. Some people are like that. Ghosts with warm hands. You don't chase them with questions. One cold January morning, snow drifting in sideways through the street lamps, Mason noticed something. The man's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. Barely noticeable, but Mason noticed. "You okay, sir?" he asked, for the first time breaking the invisible boundary they'd silently agreed upon. The man blinked. "Just winter catching. Up to old bones," he said, voice thin but steady. Mason nodded, then quietly brought over a second napkin and folded it for insulation under the mug. The man looked at him again, longer this time. "What's your name?" "Mason." A pause. "Thank you, Mason." He left the usual tip that morning, but Mason didn't touch it. He let it sit, then slid it into the donation jar near the register for a local shelter. Later that afternoon, Mason wiped the booth clean and found a folded piece of paper. A receipt turned over. On it, in tidy handwriting, were 3 words, "Silent kindness echoes." He turned it over. No name. Just the receipt from a black coffee. 1.75. The days bled together like watercolors. Spring crept in slowly, hesitant. After a long, grey winter, the diner began to warm, not just in temperature, but in presence. Mason's rhythm never changed. His hands knew the dance of plates and cups and tired smiles. The man, still unnamed in Mason's world, continued his routine. Always 6:15, always booth by the window, always alone. But now, sometimes, he'd nod before Mason arrived. Sometimes he'd slide a napkin closer if Mason had too many plates to carry. Little things, quiet acknowledgements. One morning in late April, a subtle change. The man brought with him a small book, worn leather cover, frayed edges. He didn't open it, just placed it on the table beside his notepad. Mason didn't ask. He just refilled the coffee and left it there, letting silence do the talking, but curiosity whispered. Later, as he cleaned the booth, Mason glanced at the book left behind. It wasn't forgotten, just placed deliberately. Its cover read, faintly, Embossed, principles and quiet fortunes, notes on life unspoken. Inside the cover, an inscription, to those who pour without expecting to be filled. No name, no date, just that. Mason placed it carefully in the lost and found drawer behind the counter. The next morning, the man was back. The book wasn't mentioned. Mason didn't return it. He waited. On the third day, the man looked at him more directly than usual. "You read it?" Mason hesitated, then nodded. "Just the inscription." A beat passed. "That's the best part," the man said almost to himself. After that, things changed. Not dramatically, but subtly. The man began leaving brief notes, scribbled on napkins, or receipts. Little thoughts. Wealth isn't what you hold, it's what you walk away from. The most powerful influence is the one no one notices. Compassion without announcement is legacy. Mason started collecting them in a box at home, not out of sentimentality, but something quieter. Like preserving something you don't quite understand yet, but know you will. He still didn't know the man's name, but by now he didn't need to. It was a rainy Thursday when the man didn't show. 15 came, then 6:30. Mason looked out through the fog glass, the streets slick with memory, the booth remained empty. By 7 he knew it wasn't absence, it was departure. The following mornings were quieter. The coffee machine still hissed. The regulars still came and went, their lives moving forward in predictable arcs. But the booth by the window remained untouched. Mason didn't say anything, not to his co-workers, not to the customers who sometimes glanced at the empty space as if they too noticed something missing, though none of them had ever spoken to the man. He wiped the table each day at 6:45, though no one had sat there. It became a small ritual, one born not out of hope but respect. 3 weeks passed. Then, one morning in May, just before dawn, Mason returned from the back with a tray of clean mugs and found a letter waiting for him at the counter. His name was written in soft, deliberate script across a cream envelope. Mason Reeves. He opened it slowly, hands suddenly unsure. Inside a letter. "Dear Mason, some mornings give more than others. Some people pour without realizing they are fountains. You served me coffee. But more than that, you offered silence, you offered presence. I've lived long enough to know how rare that is. I am not who I appeared to be, but that matters little. What matters is what you've given without seeking return." Enclosed is an address. There is something waiting for you there. I hope you'll accept it not as a gift, but as recognition. Legacy is not what we leave behind in assets. It's what we awaken quietly in others. "Warm regards," Warren Mason stared at the name. It couldn't be. It could. But he had no way to prove it. There was no last name, just Warren. But suddenly so many fragments fit together. The quiet demeanor, the reflections, the notes, the absence. The address was to a law office on the other side of town. Simple, unassuming, the kind of place you'd pass without a second glance. He went the next day, dressed in his only blazer, one his mother had bought him before her illness. At the front desk, he handed the letter to the receptionist, who read it without surprise. She nodded once. "We've been expecting you." Inside the office, a man in a charcoal suit greeted him. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Thomas Langley, Mr. Warren's attorney." Mason sat, unsure. Langley opened a folder. "Mr. Warren requested that this be transferred to you upon his passing." "Passing?" Mason's voice cracked on the word. Langley paused. "He passed peacefully. 1 week ago." Mason leaned back. The silence wasn't just absence. It had been finality, Langley continued. He set up a trust, modest by some standards, significant by most. More importantly, he left a letter for you. He handed over a sealed envelope, heavier than the first. Mason opened it slowly. Inside, a single page, handwritten. "Mason, I once gave away billions with headlines, but I've learned that real giving happens when no one is looking. You reminded me what that means. There is enough here for you to pursue what you've quietly held back on. I suspect you know what that is. Use it not to change who you are. Use it to remain exactly who you've been. With deep gratitude, Warren Buffett. That evening, Mason walked the long way home. The city moved around him like background music, horns, voices, the hum of lives in motion. But inside, he was somewhere else entirely. He kept seeing Warren's eyes, calm, present, the kind of eyes that saw through you, but never at you. Mason turned onto the familiar street that led to his apartment. The sidewalk cracks, the dim light. Above the door, the smell of cooked rice from a neighbor's window. It was all the same. But he was different. He entered quietly. His younger brother Leo was asleep on the couch, textbooks spread open like fallen wings. He'd been studying for weeks, preparing for college entrance exams, a dream they both carried, even if only one of them had a real shot. Mason looked at him and remembered another night, years earlier. Their mother, pale from chemo, sat at the kitchen table while Mason, 17 and already working nights, brewed her tea. "I'm sorry this is your life now," she had whispered, and Mason, placing the cup gently in front of her, had said, "It's not life now, it's just life. And I'm in it with you." She died 2 weeks later. But that moment had etched itself into him. The idea that staying, just staying, was its own kind of gift. Now, standing in the apartment's silence, he pulled out the second letter again. Read the words slowly. Use it not to change who you are. Use it to remain exactly who you've been. The next morning, he made coffee the way he always had. He served the same customers, smiled the same smile. But after his shift, he visited a local community center, one he had once volunteered at briefly before extra shifts became necessary. He met with the director, an older woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice. "I'd like to sponsor a scholarship program," Mason said, "for kids like my brother, for families like mine." She blinked, caught off guard. "That's generous. May I ask why?" Mason didn't know how to explain it fully, but he said, "Because someone believed in what I didn't say, and I want to pass that on." That week, he filed paperwork. Quietly, without announcements or interviews, he named it the Silent Kindness Fund. It didn't solve everything. Leo still had to study. Bills still came. But something shifted, not just around Mason, within him. At night, he began journaling. Reflections, ideas, small notes inspired by the ones Warren used to leave. He never signed them. He simply placed them. Around the diner, under saucers, inside napkin dispensers, slipped between receipts. One read, "Sometimes the richest people leave behind no name, only warmth." The first person to find one of Mason's notes was a nurse named Carolina. She came in every Tuesday morning after the graveyard shift, always ordering oatmeal and green tea. Her eyes were tired, her scrubs wrinkled, her kindness barely holding together through exhaustion. She found the note folded beneath her cup. "You're allowed to be tired. Even light rests sometimes." She didn't ask who wrote it. She didn't need to. The next week, she left a $5 bill with a note scribbled on it. "For someone hungrier than me today." Mason tucked it quietly into the donation jar and said nothing. It became a ripple, not loud, not immediate, but steady. A man named Rick, who'd just lost his job, found a note inside the sugar container. "Being useful isn't the same as being valuable. You are both." He didn't cry in the diner, but he did come back the next day with 2 job applications in his hand. He filled them out in silence, drank his coffee, and left. By the end of the month, regulars were bringing in extra groceries to donate to the shelter box at the corner. One customer started tipping double, then quietly asked Mason to pass the extra to someone who needed it more. No one talked about it directly, but everyone felt it. Mason never revealed the source. He never wanted to be seen as the origin. That was the point. Warren had shown him that true presence is invisible, like warmth in the sun. You only notice it's missing when it's gone. One evening, just as Mason was finishing his shift, Leo walked into the diner. He held a letter in his hand, a college acceptance envelope, the seal broken but trembling with joy. "I got in," Leo whispered. "Full scholarship." Mason's breath caught in his chest. He nodded slowly, didn't say anything at first. Then, just like their mother had once said to him, he reached out and whispered, "You're ready." They stood there for a long time, not needing words. The past, the loss, the nights without sleep, the quiet resilience, it all settled in that one embrace. That night, Mason walked home alone under the soft hum of streetlights. He carried nothing with him, but felt as though he held something vast. As he passed a small community garden, he paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, placed it gently under a stone by the bench. Legacy isn't what you leave. It's what grows because you stayed. He didn't look back. It was late autumn when the letter arrived. No envelope this time, just a folded sheet slipped under the door of the diner before sunrise. Mason found it as he opened for the morning. Shift. It was written in the same careful script as the first letters, though slightly shakier, aged. "Dear Mason, you never needed my name to know my heart, but I will give it now, because you gave me yours in silence. I was Warren Edward Buffett. And I was tired, not of life, but of noise. In you, I found the stillness I longed for. In your gesture, I rediscovered the kind of wealth that can't be measured. You gave me more than coffee. You gave me presence, without expectation. That saved me in a way no investment ever could, and so I pass on to you not my name, but the right to carry what it means to give invisibly. You are the heir to something more enduring than fortune, quiet grace. Live richly, by leaving gently." Always, Warren Mason stood behind the counter long after reading it. The morning crowd moved in and out like waves, unaware of the quiet shift in the tide. That afternoon he visited the place where Warren had once sat, now unused for months. He cleaned the table, polished the window, placed a small card holder at the edge of the booth. Inside it, a single card, reserved for the invisible. He never explained it to anyone, but those who came often started to notice, and in their own way, they understood. The booth remained empty, except when someone needed it most. A man going through a divorce once sat there without knowing why, then left behind a napkin note that read, "I didn't know I could feel seen by no one." Another time, a teenager failing school spent an hour there in silence, then asked Mason if he could help her apply for a job. The booth became a symbol, not of grief, of space. Space for healing, space for quiet, space for presence. Years passed. Mason grew older, and eventually he bought the diner from the retiring owner. He made no changes to the menu, no grand announcements. Just fixed the light above the booth and added a second donation jar. This one labeled, "Because someone once believed in me." The diner remained open through seasons, storms, and slow mornings. It didn't expand, it didn't modernize, but it never emptied. Mason never became famous. There were no articles, no podcasts. Only stories passed in hushes between people who had felt something inexplicable during a visit, an unseen hand on their shoulder, a warmth in the quiet. The booth by the window remained untouched most days, except when someone unknowingly needed it. A young woman once sat there after losing her job. She found a folded note left behind from days earlier. "Your worth was never in what you produced. It was always in your presence." She didn't finish her tea, but she left smiling. Another day, a father sat with his son, not speaking, just holding space. Mason brought them 2 hot chocolates without charge. The father nodded once. Quietly, he left behind a drawing his son had made of the booth. Underneath it, in a child's uneven print, "This is where my dad talked without words. People began leaving things, not because they were told to, but because the space called for it. A pair of gloves in winter, a poem in spring, a business card with a note scribbled, "Hiring. Ask for Leah." No one claimed credit. That was the point, and every evening Mason would check the booth. Sometimes he'd find a folded receipt with a phrase that wasn't his. Being here helped. One summer, Leo returned from university to visit. He wore a simple suit now, and his eyes had gained the weight of someone beginning to understand the world. He sat at the counter, watched his brother pour coffee, and finally said, "You know, they don't come for the food." Mason smiled softly, eyes never leaving the cup he filled. "I know. They come for him, don't they? For Warren." Mason considered that, then replied, "They come for who they are, when they remember someone like him." Later that night, Mason sat at the booth himself for the first time in years. He brought no coffee, no pen, just sat. Outside, the world moved on, loud, fast, hungry. Inside, one man remembered another. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't alone. Some years later, on a morning much like any other, a young man walked into the diner. He looked around as if unsure why he had come. He was dressed in the uniform of someone who worked long hours on his feet. His eyes were alert but tired. Mason, now older, greeted him with a warm nod and placed a cup of coffee in front of him without asking. The man blinked, surprised. "I didn't order. It's on us," Mason said simply, voice soft with time. The man hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet "thank you." He sat at the counter first. But as the diner filled, Mason gently gestured toward the booth by the window. "If you need space, it's open." The man moved slowly, almost reverently, sat down, looked out and waited. He didn't know why. Not yet. But something about the booth, the air around it, the way the light fell, made him feel as though he had stepped into a memory that didn't belong to him, yet somehow lived inside him. Beneath the salt shaker, he found a folded note. "You don't need to be known to matter." He read it twice. Outside, the morning deepened. People passed by the window. The world moved, but the booth stayed still. Mason watched from the counter. Didn't speak. He'd learned that some things shouldn't be narrated, only felt. The young man stayed for an hour, then rose and left a single coin on the table. More symbolic than valuable. As he exited, he turned back briefly, as if to ask something, but decided not to. He walked out into the day, changed in a way he couldn't name, and the booth remained, empty, ready, as it always was. Later that evening, Mason placed a fresh card in the holder. He no longer wrote the notes himself. Others did now. Some were left by customers, others mailed anonymously. The legacy had long outgrown him. He stood by the window for a moment longer than usual, then turned off the light and left the door slightly open behind him, because some places, like some people, are meant to remain open for whoever might need them next. Mason had never planned for the booth to become anything more than a quiet tribute, but something about stillness invites need, and slowly word spread, though never loudly. They came in ones and twos, people who didn't look broken, but who carried silence like weight. Some sat and left without ordering. Others stayed for hours, sipping slowly, reading, or simply watching the world pass. Mason welcomed them all the same. Eliza, now a steady hand beside him at the counter, began to notice patterns. "They never ask questions," she said one night, watching another quiet visitor fold a note and leave it under the sugar jar. "They don't need to," Mason replied. In time, Mason added a small wooden box beneath. The counter labeled only "left behind." Inside were hundreds of slips, some with drawings, others with words, none signed. One read, "This booth held my grief when no one else could." Another, "I came here every Sunday until I remembered how to miss her gently." Some messages were just a word. Breathing. Still here. Enough. Mason never displayed them. He believed in privacy, in the sacredness of unspoken truths. But he read them one by one during quiet hours when the world outside felt far away. Then one rainy afternoon, a young man entered, barefoot, soaked, shivering. Mason met him at the door with a towel and a hot mug. The man looked at him with wide, confused eyes. "I don't have anything," he said. Mason just pointed to the booth. "You don't need anything." He stayed for 2 hours, didn't speak a word, just stared out the window as the rain traced slow patterns down the glass. When he finally left, he tucked something under the salt shaker. Mason found it later. A note, water-blurred, ink bleeding at the edges. "I came here to disappear, but someone saw me anyway." That night, Mason walked home slower than usual. He passed the church on 8th Street, the bookstore he and Leo once visited, the park bench where he'd sat after reading Warren's final letter. The city was changing. New faces, new towers, louder sounds. But in his corner of it, something still hummed softly. When he reached home, he opened a drawer filled with old napkins, ones he hadn't seen in years. Messages Warren had left him, folded and kept. He unfolded one. "Kindness is never lost. It just waits for the right hands." Mason held it to his chest. He didn't cry, but his eyes remained closed for a long time. It was early spring when Mason first felt the weight in his chest that wouldn't go away. He didn't speak of it. Not to Eliza, not to Leo, who now visited only occasionally, always with stories from his teaching job and the non-profit he'd co-founded, an echo of Mason's quiet legacy. Mason simply moved slower, watched more, felt more. The booth remained. The same, though. Its window fogged each morning, cleared by mid-morning light. Visitors continued, grief-worn, soul-weary, wordless and waiting. Some stayed a minute, some returned every week. Mason took comfort in that. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 entered with his grandmother. They sat by the booth and she ordered a tea for herself, hot cocoa for him. Mason served them with his usual soft smile. The boy tugged at his sleeve. "Is this the booth that helps people?" Mason nodded. The boy pulled a crumpled drawing from his pocket and laid it on the table. A stick figure with a heart too big for its chest. Beneath it, scribbled in red pencil, "I hope your heart feels better soon." Mason didn't know if the boy meant him or the world, but he kept the drawing. That evening, Eliza locked up while Mason sat alone in the darkened diner. A single lamp lit the counter. The world outside was fading into the cool blue of dusk. Eliza approached and placed a mug of tea in front of him. "You've given them all a space to heal," she said softly. "When are you going to let someone do the same for you?" Mason looked out the window. For the first time, he allowed the tears to come, not from sadness, but from release. Weeks passed, then months. Mason began training Eliza in the finer details, not just the recipes, the bookkeeping, the maintenance, but the invisible things. "How do you know when someone needs the booth?" she asked. He thought a moment. "They don't always know. It themselves. You feel it before they do. It's in the way they sit, the way they don't order." Eliza nodded. She was learning. One morning, Mason didn't open the diner. Instead, Eliza found a letter taped to the inside of the door. It was addressed to her. "Eliza, if you're reading this, I've taken the long walk Warren once took. I've left you the diner. Not for the business, but for the space. Protect it, hold it, keep it for the ones who can't name what they need. And when you find yourself tired, sit at the booth. It holds more than sorrow now. It holds all of us. With quiet love, Mason." Diner opened on time the next morning. Eliza, hands trembling but heart steady, turned on the lights, brewed the coffee, and placed fresh napkins at every table. She moved through the space like someone remembering a dance they hadn't practiced in years. but somehow never forgot. When the first customer entered, she greeted them with the same warmth Mason once gave. Not loud, not performative, just there, the booth remained untouched until mid-morning when a woman walked in. She was in her 40s, dressed like she'd come from a hospital waiting room. Her eyes carried a storm. Eliza didn't ask. She simply brought a cup of tea and gestured to the window seat. The woman sat without a word. Later, after she left, Eliza found a note beneath the coaster. "I didn't need answers. Just quiet. Thank you." Eliza placed it in the wooden box. The tradition lived on. Over time, regulars began calling the space Mason's booth, though no sign bore his name. Some left folded notes, others left nothing, but everyone who sat there left lighter. Leo came by more often now. He helped Eliza with paperwork, fixed the flickering kitchen light, sat at the booth when no one was looking. "This place feels like him," he said once. "Like breathing when you didn't know you'd been holding your breath." They never held a service. Mason wouldn't have wanted one. Instead, on the anniversary of his passing, Eliza printed one of his saved napkin notes and framed it on the wall behind the counter. The richest legacies don't echo loudly. They settle quietly in the hearts of others. No one ever asked who wrote it, but they read it again and again. Years passed. Eliza grew into the role. The diner stayed small, but people came from farther away now. Not because of marketing, because someone had told them softly, "Go there." They came because they needed stillness, because they'd forgotten their own worth, because someone had once given them presents, and they needed to remember what that felt like. And always, the booth waited, not a monument, a mirror, one that didn't reflect faces, but truths. It was a boy who started it again, different from the first. This one was older, maybe 13, maybe 15. He came in alone one afternoon, shoulders curled inward, headphones around his neck, eyes that didn't meet anyone's. Eliza greeted him gently. He nodded barely. "Anywhere you like," she said. He sat at the booth without hesitation. There was no note waiting that day. But Eliza brought him a glass of water, then placed a napkin on the table, blank save for a pen beside it. She didn't say anything else. The boy didn't write. Not then. But he returned the next day, and the next. On the fourth visit, he left. A folded napkin on the table. "I don't talk much, but this place does." Eliza added it to the box. She began seeing a pattern. Those who returned often began writing notes not for themselves, but for whoever might sit there next. One day, someone left a stack of blank cards, tied with a ribbon and a note, "For the next soul who needs to hear what they forgot they believed." The tradition shifted again. Not just reflections left behind, but encouragement passed forward. And through it all, the booth remained unchanged. The city changed. Buildings rose, new coffee shops appeared. But this little diner stayed as it was. Sometimes, visitors would ask if the stories were true. Was there really a man named Mason? Did he really never ask for anything in return? Was the booth really started by someone famous? Eliza never answered directly. She simply offered them a seat. Those who stayed long enough found their answer in the quiet. One cold December morning, Eliza arrived early. The air was still. Snowflakes clung to the window like they were afraid to fall. She opened the door, turned on the lights, and stood behind the counter. Everything was ready. She reached into the wooden box and pulled out one note at random. It was one of Mason's, written long before she'd met him. Some lives change the world not by leading, but by waiting, one seat at a time. She read it once, then placed it on the counter where everyone could see. Outside, the sky lightened, and inside, the diner waited. Small, warm, quiet, for the next person to walk in, not looking for transformation, just needing to sit down. The boy who had once left a napkin note now came every Saturday. Sometimes he'd write, sometimes he'd just sit. One day he brought a friend. They didn't speak much, but when they left, 2 napkins remained. He doesn't know how to say he's hurting, so I brought him here. It's the first time I've eaten without feeling like I didn't deserve it. Eliza read them both and added them to the archive, now housed in 3 boxes beneath the counter. She had begun scanning them too, preserving what couldn't be kept forever on paper. Leo helped her create a digital project, anonymous, sacred, a growing collection of human truth, written in coffee-stained ink and folded with trembling hands. He called it the Silent Booth. No promotions, just a link, a space, a legacy. Sometimes, teachers used the site to open discussions. Therapists printed messages and kept them on their desks. A musician once wrote to Eliza, saying one of the notes inspired a song that helped him climb out of addiction. It wasn't viral, it was vital. Then, one morning, as the sunlight hit the booth just right, Eliza noticed something she hadn't seen before, etched faintly into the wood where Mason had always rested his hand. She leaned closer. It wasn't new. It had been there all along, worn, soft by years of use, carved in delicate letters, so faded it nearly disappeared into the grain. "Thank you, Warren." She touched it lightly. It was never about the name, never about the money. It was always about what one quiet presence had given to another, and how that gift refused to stop giving. Later that week, she received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside, a single note on textured paper. "I was the young man Mason helped years ago. He didn't know what I carried, but he knew I needed somewhere to lay it down. I've opened a small clinic now, for those who live like I once did, unseen." We named the first counseling room Booth 615. I thought he might like to know. Eliza placed the letter gently into a new box, one she labeled Echoes, because by then she understood. Some kindnesses never end, they simply pass hands. It was a Tuesday when Eliza found the envelope. No return address, no stamp, just a single word written across the front. Continue. Inside, a letter typed clean, anonymous. "I visited once, years ago. I sat at the booth after my brother passed. I couldn't speak, couldn't even cry, but someone brought the tea and didn't ask questions. There was a note under the cup. Some wounds don't need words, just room to exist." I took a photo of it. It's still the background on my phone. That day, something shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. I'm a therapist now. I keep your notes in a drawer. I offer silence before solutions. This place, your presence, changed more than one life. Please don't stop. Eliza read it twice, then placed it gently in the Echoes box. She didn't need recognition, but moments like this reminded her that presence, like sunlight, works best when it's quiet, consistent, and free. She began writing her own notes now. Small ones, always unsigned. Words that had helped her. Phrases Mason used to say. "There is no wrong way to begin again. The world won't pause, but you can." Even quiet people leave echoes. Each week, a handful would be slipped into the booth, and more often than not, they'd be gone the next day, taken, folded into wallets, held between hands, tucked into journals. She never saw who took them, and that was the beauty of it. One early evening, as she closed up, a woman lingered by the register. She was older, with silver hair and an elegant stillness. "I used to come here when he was alive," the woman said, voice soft. Eliza didn't need to ask who. The woman looked toward the booth. "He spoke so little, but he noticed everything. He left space for others without needing to fill it." She paused. "I come back sometimes just to remember what being seen feels like." Eliza nodded gently. "You're always welcome here." The woman smiled, then placed a folded note into Eliza's hand before leaving. Eliza waited until the door had closed, opened it slowly. The richest legacies are lived, not written. Eliza kept the note in her apron pocket for weeks. She touched it sometimes during slow afternoons, as if grounding herself in the invisible presence that still lingered through the walls, the counter, the scent of warm coffee in the air. One Sunday morning, a man in his 60s entered the diner with his granddaughter. They sat at the booth. Eliza brought them a pot of tea, said nothing more. The man looked around slowly, almost reverently. "This place feels like a held breath," he murmured. His granddaughter asked what that meant. "It's where silence doesn't feel empty," he replied. When they left, Eliza found a child's drawing on the table, stick figures holding hands beneath a sun that smiled. Written above, "My grandpa was happy here." She added it to the growing collection of artifacts, ordinary items imbued with meaning, layered over time like sediment. That night, she stayed late, not cleaning, not sorting, just sitting. She took one of Mason's oldest napkin notes and placed it on the booth's table for the first time in years. It read, "Kindness is the inheritance that never depletes." Then she did something new. She placed a second napkin beside it, blank with a pen, an invitation. The next morning, it was gone. In its place, a new note. "This table saved me. I hope it saves someone else too." From that day on, the booth became more than a space of memory. It became a space of participation, of quiet passing. Notes came and went. Messages nested inside other messages. A woman began writing responses in the margins. A boy left origami cranes folded from notebook paper, each with a word inside: stay, rest, hope. Eliza never directed any of it. She only made sure the booth stayed open, the tea stayed warm, the quiet stayed sacred, and when new staff joined, she trained them not just in how to serve, but how to listen. She taught them Mason's first lesson. You're not here to fix anyone, just to make sure they have space to remember who they are. And slowly, the booth began to glow. Not literally, but in the way places do when they've held too many stories to ever feel empty again. The years moved softly. The walls of the diner gained a patina, history etched in fingerprints. Laughter, silent tears. The booth by the window aged gracefully. The wood darkened, the cushions thinned, but it remained the heart of the place. Eliza once found a small group of high school students sitting there late one afternoon. They spoke in whispers, took turns, reading from folded notes left behind. One girl, glasses sliding down her nose, wiped a tear and said, "This feels like the opposite of social media." Her friend laughed gently. "Yeah, like it's real but doesn't want anything from you." They left behind a message scrawled in permanent marker on the back of a receipt. "We believed again, even if just for today." Eliza placed it in the archive, now expanded into shelves behind the counter. She scanned each new note, dated it, filed it. Not for display, only for safekeeping. And in that growing hidden record lived decades of invisible healing. Then one afternoon, Eliza's phone buzzed with a message from Leo. "Thought of him today. Someone in my class asked what legacy really means. I told them it's what stays behind when no one's left to explain it." She read it twice, then looked at the booth. It was empty, but only in the way a well is empty, still holding something. Even when unseen, she sat for a while, not because she needed comfort, but because she wanted to be reminded. A man passed by outside, paused at the window, and peered in. He looked tired, unsure. Eliza watched as he slowly opened the door, stepped in, and stood uncertainly near the entrance. She gestured gently toward the booth. He hesitated, then walked to it, sat. She brought him coffee and placed a folded napkin beside his cup. No words, just the gesture. As she walked away, she heard him exhale. Not heavily, but like someone setting down a weight carried too far. That evening, as she swept the floor, she found the napkin under his cup. He hadn't written on it, just folded it. Again, smaller, neater. Sometimes she realized presence leaves no mark at all, and that too is a kind of grace. Winter returned, as it always did, blanketing the city in stillness. The kind of cold that softens sound, slows footsteps, asks for reflection. Inside the diner, the warmth remained. Not just from the heating or the mugs of tea and coffee, but from the presence that had grown and matured with every word left. Behind, every silence respected. One evening, just as the snow began to fall, Eliza lit a single candle at the booth. Not because the power was out, but because she wanted to mark something. She didn't tell anyone what, but those who entered that night noticed. They lowered their voices. They lingered a little longer. Someone brought in a basket of muffins and left them by the counter with a note. For anyone who forgot to eat. Another person wrote simply, "Thank you for holding the parts of us no one else does." The next morning, the candle was gone. Eliza had let it burn out naturally. Wax pooled gently on the plate beneath it. She folded the remaining wick into a napkin and tucked it into the archive. Not everything needs to be preserved whole. Sometimes the remnants speak louder. One afternoon, a reporter came in. Young, eager, curious. He'd heard about the booth from a friend and wanted to write a story. "I think people should know," he said. "This place is special." Eliza smiled kindly. "It is, but not because of stories." He blinked. "What then?" She paused, then said, "Because here, no one needs to explain themselves." The reporter stayed for coffee. He didn't take any photos. When he left, he placed a note under the salt shaker. "I didn't write the article, I kept the experience." The note joined the others. That night, as Eliza closed the diner, she stood by the booth, one hand resting on the wood, worn smooth by decades of quiet hands. She didn't think about Mason. She didn't think about Warren. She thought about the boy who would one day walk through the door, unseen, unheard, carrying something heavy. And she prayed that when he sat, the booth would still be ready, because some legacies don't need generations to survive. Only the next moment, and the one after that. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday no one remembers, no special date, no holiday. But someone walked in, just like always. A woman this time, early 30s, a kind of stillness around her that spoke of recent unraveling. She wore her coat too tightly, as if holding herself in. She looked around the diner, unsure. Eliza didn't ask questions. She simply smiled and gestured gently toward the booth. The woman sat. Tea was brought without a word, a napkin and pen placed on the table beside it. For 20 minutes, she stared out the window. Then she wrote, just one line. She folded the napkin, placed it beneath the empty sugar jar and left. Eliza waited until the door had closed, then walked over, unfolded the message slowly. "Today, I chose to stay." She didn't cry, but she closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. That note didn't go to the archive. It remained on the table the rest of the week. Visitors read it. No one moved it. Some sat longer after reading. Some left notes beside it. By Sunday, the table held 7 napkins. One read, "Me too." Another, "We don't have to stay strong, just stay." Eliza didn't remove them. She let them speak to one another. Let the booth become not just a place of solitary reflection, but of silent communion. No grand gestures, no signatures, just one, human choosing to remain, and others gently following. And so the booth endured, not by force, not by fame, but because it had become what Warren once wrote to Mason, a place where silent kindness echoes, a place where lives shifted, not through noise, but through presence. And when Eliza eventually handed the keys to someone new, years later, quietly without ceremony, she left just one instruction: keep the booth open. Years later, the booth still stood, a little more worn, the table a shade darker, the cushion edges frayed, but the heart of it, untouched. Eliza had moved on. Not far, just enough to let the legacy evolve. She visited sometimes, but never sat. She watched others do it, smiled quietly, and left without needing to be seen. The new keeper of the diner was a man named Theo. Young, gentle-voiced, and chosen for one reason. He listened with his eyes. Theo never tried to be Mason or Eliza. He just protected the space, and the space, in turn, did what it always had: receive, soften, hold. Visitors still came. More than before even. Some knew the story. Most didn't. But the feeling, the presence, that needed no explanation. One afternoon, a woman in a sharp suit and weary eyes entered between meetings. She sat, said nothing. Theo brought her coffee, a napkin, and a pen. She didn't write that day. But a week later, she returned. And this time she left something behind. I've led thousands, but I've never felt as gently led as I did in this booth. The napkin joined the archive, now digitized, now open to the world, not for fame, but for access. A library of lives, handwritten and anonymous, curated by quiet. Theo once asked Eliza during a visit, "Do you ever miss it?" She looked at the booth, at the people around it. "No," she said, "because it never left." Legacy had become something shared now, passed not by instruction, but by instinct. Children of past visitors came. They recognized the feeling without ever hearing the story, and when the booth was temporarily closed for repairs one week, someone left a note taped to the window. "Please bring back the stillness." It returned the next day, because some things are too needed to pause for long. And somewhere, even now, someone new walks into that diner, carrying something too heavy for words, and finds not a miracle, but space. In the quiet hours before dawn, the diner breathed differently, not from the ovens or the old coffee machine, but from the notes, the wood, the worn paths of footsteps repeating sacred patterns. Theo came in early that morning, not to open, but to sit. He brought no phone, no agenda, just himself. He made tea, placed 2 cups on the table, one for himself, one untouched. He sat at the booth. It had been years since he'd done that. He looked out at the street, empty, peaceful, and slowly he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter. It was old, worn at the folds. He'd been carrying it for years, a letter from his mother, written before her death, never sent. It read, "I know I failed in many ways, but I hope that someday, somewhere, someone will hold you in the silence you never received from me. I hope. There will be a place where you'll feel, even for a moment, that you're enough." Theo placed it gently on the table, not for anyone to read, just for the booth to witness. Then he picked up a pen, and on a napkin wrote, "You are allowed to be whole even after breaking." He folded it once, placed it under the cup meant for someone else, and stood. That day a woman sat there and found the note. She didn't take it with her. She left it in view. Later a teenager sat down, read it, and added a new one beside it. "I've been trying to believe this. Thank you." The notes remained. Others came and added their own. By evening the table held 7, each one a fragment, a thread, a voice in a choir that sang without sound. Theo watched from the counter. He didn't claim credit, didn't explain. He simply wiped the counter with calm hands and met each visitor's gaze with something rare. Not friendliness, not service, but presence. And presence, he'd learned, was the rarest form of love. That night, he closed the diner. Late. He turned off the lights and stood by the booth a final moment, not to say goodbye, but to listen. Because the booth, even after all these years, still spoke softly, like someone breathing beside you in the dark, reminding you you're not alone. It was years later when the question finally came. A child, maybe 10, standing near the counter with his father, pointed to the booth and asked, "Why is that table special?" Theo paused. He could have said many things about Mason, about Warren, About loss, healing, invisible kindness, but he didn't. He crouched to the boy's level, looked gently into his curious eyes and said, "Because people remember who they are when they sit there." The boy blinked, processing, then nodded as if that made sense. Later, Theo wrote the exchange down, added it to the archive, labeled it simply a new question, a new answer. That same week, someone left behind a thin book, hand-bound, unmarked. Inside, dozens of napkin notes copied in. Clean handwriting, the final page read, "I wanted to carry this with me, now I return it so others can too." Theo placed it near the booth. No display, just presence. Over time, people began to bring others, not to show them something, but to give them something. They'd gesture to the booth without explanation. A friend, a parent, a partner would sit and wait, and something quiet would begin. A remembering, a releasing, a resting. The diner never expanded, never renovated, but somehow it grew, in meaning, in memory. In the unspoken knowing that something sacred lived there, not because of religion or belief, but because of the accumulated care of countless unseen moments. And still, every morning, the booth by the window welcomed light, sometimes empty, sometimes full, always ready. And in that readiness was the truth of it all, that the richest lives don't need spotlight, they only need space. That night, the wind moved through the city like a whisper, not cold, not harsh, just present. Inside the diner, the lights dimmed one by one. The sound of the coffee machine winding. Down echoed like a heartbeat settling. Theo stood behind the counter, watching the last guest of the evening walk slowly toward the booth. A woman with quiet steps, holding something invisible in her arms. Grief, maybe, or memory. She sat, didn't order, just breathed. Theo didn't interrupt. Instead, he stepped outside for a moment, letting the door swing shut behind him. The air outside was crisp. The sky above was clear, stars unashamed of their silence. He looked up and exhaled, and in that breath lived the whole story of Warren, who gave without noise, of Mason, who served with his soul, of Eliza, who held the space open, of Theo, who received. The legacy not as a weight, but as a rhythm. Inside, the woman at the booth wrote something on a napkin. She folded it, placed it beneath the cup, and left quietly. Theo returned, stepped behind the counter, and watched her go. Then he walked to the table, unfolded the note. "Thank you for reminding me that I matter, not because of what I do, but because I am still here." He didn't archive this one. He left it on the table. The next day, it was joined by another, and then another. Not all were written. Some were drawings, some folded pieces of fabric. One was a pressed flower, each one a whisper saying the same thing: "I'm still here, and I see you too." Years later, no plaque was installed. No sign hung above the booth. No documentary aired. But the story continued, wordless and undenied, in strangers who made space for one another, in notes written to no one, yet meant for everyone. In the knowledge that presence is more lasting than applause, the booth became not an artifact, but a portal to the best in us, to the gentlest, to the parts we forget in the rush to prove something. And so, the story never ended. It only paused. Every time someone walked in, took a breath, and sat down. In the final drawer of the counter behind the extra menus and old order slips, Theo kept a small handmade book. The cover was plain, faded brown cloth, stitched corners. Inside were notations, not from guests, but from those who had kept the booth alive. From Mason. Sometimes, when I didn't know who I was, serving someone reminded me. From Eliza. The act of holding space is sacred work. Not everyone sees it. That's what makes it holy. From Theo himself, I didn't inherit a business. I inherited a rhythm of care. He never showed the book to anyone. It wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be remembered. A private echo of all the invisible labor behind every poured cup, every untouched question, every patient silence. One night, a storm knocked the power out. The diner went dark. Rather than close, Theo lit candles one by one and placed them. On each table, customers came anyway. They whispered, shared stories, left napkin notes written by candlelight. When the lights came back the next morning, someone had written on the window in breath-fogged glass, "Darkness didn't scare us. We were already held. It faded with the sun. Theo didn't wipe it away." And that's how the diner lived. Not with expansion, not with reinvention, but with return. Of people, of memories, of presence. One day, an elderly woman sat at the booth for 3 hours. Theo brought her water, then coffee, then tea. She didn't speak. When she finally stood, she touched the table gently and said, "My husband sat here once, 27 years ago. I didn't understand it then. I do now." She left behind a pressed daisy and a photo. The image showed a young man sitting in the booth, smiling gently. Theo recognized the face, Mason. Theo placed the photo in the archive gently alongside the daisy. No label, no date, just presence, and that became his ritual. Every Sunday before opening, he'd sit at the booth for 5 minutes, not to write, not to pray, just to be, to feel the lineage of stillness that passed through hands like water through stone, shaping everything without breaking anything. On the wall behind the counter, Eliza's framed napkin remained. The richest legacies don't echo loudly. They settle quietly in the hearts of others. It was no longer decoration, it was compass. Theo trained new staff not in tasks, but in tone. "It's not about what you do," he'd say. "It's about what you don't interrupt." And they understood, because in time, you don't need instructions to follow quietness. You only need to listen. One snowy morning, a young woman entered the diner wrapped in a coat too thin for the season. Her eyes darted, her hands trembled. She hovered by the counter. Theo offered a cup of tea without speaking. She took it, stared at the steam. Then she whispered, "Is it true that this place helps people?" Theo nodded once. She glanced at the booth. He gestured softly. She sat. That day, she didn't write. But when she left, she placed her bus ticket on the table. On its back, scribbled in pen, "I changed my mind. I'm staying." Theo didn't archive that either. He framed it, placed it above the booth, behind a panel of glass. No plaque. No spotlight. Just a gesture, and that was how the story continued, not through telling, through holding, through space that asked nothing but offered everything, through a cup of tea at the right time, through a stranger who didn't ask, "What's wrong?" but simply said, "Sit here," through a man named Warren who saw something in a young waiter, through a young man named Mason who gave coffee without charge and kindness without name, through a woman named Eliza, who turned presence into stewardship, through a man named Theo, who inherited not a business, but a way of being, and through everyone who ever needed a reason to believe again, in softness, in staying, in silent kindness echoing louder than legacy. Because in the end, the most enduring impact isn't what we do, it's the way we remain. If this story touched your heart in a quiet, lasting way, like this video, and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Every click helps share messages that don't shout, but stay. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and which moment in Warren's journey moved you the most. And if you're ready for another story, one that inspires without speaking loudly, that transforms without needing the spotlight, click on the next video on your screen. Because sometimes what the world needs most is just one more silent presence,